And howdy, everybody. Good morning. You might note by my indigenous speech, I'm from Texas. So apologies in advance if you were expecting Del Rodias. Del unfortunately couldn't make it today, so I'm here to give his presentation. We're going to focus on the convergence, or as some people might suggest, the collision of IT and OT. We're going to talk a little bit about resilience and just give some specific examples. This is a fairly high-level presentation, so not nearly as deep as sometimes I might like to go, but it's still going to be pretty important. So I can't see you super clearly. Okay, that's better. Let me just ask the question. How many of you folks are primarily in an IT role, be that security or networking or otherwise? Not that many, okay? Maybe you guys just don't want to admit it. All right, how many of you are associated with the industrial side? More of you, excellent. Very good. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So first we're going to talk a little bit about resilience in the semiconductor space. Dell actually worked at a chip plant. I did not work at a chip plant. But the areas that he was primarily concerned with as an operator in that area was, first off, operational error, the fact that there were system-level issues, someone didn't set up something, and then in some natural disasters. I worked with a group called INEMI, who is a electronics manufacturing org. And part of their change is that a lot of their groups are associated with contract manufacturers, meaning they have to reconfigure their manufacturing process several times a week, which is a pretty good-sized challenge. So the point being, that's the opportunity to have some system-level issues, something doesn't connect to this anymore, and so forth, or operational errors are actually fairly high. As mentioned, I did not work in a semi-fab. My first actual job in a factory-like environment was the Progresso Co-op cotton gin. Mostly pretty different, but some similar concerns here. We often had operator errors. I more than once exploded certain equipment because I made the bale too big. There were occasional system-level issues where something shut down and we'd have to drive 300 miles to go get a part to come back. And by the way, if you're the person who broke it, you had to drive up to get the part. And then we also had occasional natural disasters. I know he's referencing Fukushima. For us, because we're on the southern border of Texas, it tended to be hurricanes. Now, my father-in-law built and operated chemical plants for Goodyear. And they had operational errors that resulted in people getting badly hurt. Same thing at our cotton gin, by the way. And they also had natural disaster areas. But this realm of attacks and impacts, the things that we're talking about today, didn't really exist within his time zone. It wasn't really high on his radar. Wasn't very high on our co-op either. Our primary threat in this area tended to be the Border Patrol would come in every now and then and take away some percentage of our workers. But either way, there was a lot of different disruptions at play here that were non-standard. You just heard a great conversation with John Holkwitz and Ryan Narain talking about cyber war and such. Those were not the things that people were really concerned with. And I'll just make this point. You know, John sort of made, I'm going to make a little counterpoint. John talked about, look, it's really important for you to understand who your adversary is. In your space, I'm going to make the claim, not necessarily your adversary, but possibly the biggest threat to the continuity of your process is actually going to be your internal workers. All right, I'll just leave it at that. So designing a system to address external adversaries will have certain attributes associated with it. Designing systems that also are going to address potential issues associated with errors internally is going to look a little bit different. There's certainly going to be some shared attributes between those, but again, they're not going to be exactly quite the same. And attribution can be a heck of a lot easier at times. Okay, so we'll just kind of move things forward a little bit. Today, at least within some of these spaces, this concept of again, we heard this concept, cyber war takes a lot of different viewpoints on it. And in some cases, it is an economic battle. All right? So in certain environments, it's not so much that I am here to cause disruption. I am basically wishing to compete in an economic environment that requires, from the attacker's perspective, some balancing of technology capabilities. In other words, there are people who are very interested in understanding how your processes work, and they would like to replicate that in their home country. All right, a lot of examples of that. And there's other examples here. So we're making reference here to TSMC and various other entities. TSMC, their initial impact several years ago was incidental. Now, it happened to be a carryover or a spillover, if you will, from a very active, currently hot conflict taking place in Ukraine. So there are times where you may not necessarily be the target directly, but you are potentially a victim of these types of environments. And this is actually what happened the first time at TSMC. So again, there's a set of threats that are out there, some of which are internal. In the case of TSMC, they were looking at a geopolitical conflict. In other words, that they thought rather than people going to mainland China to get a certain set of chips, we're going to ramp up production and be able to get more production here in Taiwan. They've got somebody who's doing a factory acceptance test for some new kit. The person doing that factory acceptance test was infected themselves. That in turn spread across multiple fabs and caused outages. So even these geopolitical conflicts can drive behaviors that will indirectly result in something problematic. A big challenge of this, of course, is understanding what the actual cause is and how it is that you're going to respond to that. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about the OT attack lifecycle. I'm not super comfortable with this concept per se, but let me just put it in this perspective. There are incidents that will take place that will have an impact on your system. And then the question often becomes, well, what is the system? And we'll talk a little bit about that. As things get more sophisticated, you are making connectivity, and that connectivity results in exposure, and that exposure potentially means that you've got a greater risk. Again, at the time that my father-in-law was building plants and operating them, and actually one of which, anybody here been around long enough, remember there used to be a Goodyear chemical plant up near Calhoun? If you do remember that, he used to operate that. Prior to that, he was over in France. So if you want to talk about cultural conflict, talk about that a little bit later on. But the primary point was they had almost nothing that was connected from a networking perspective. And then eventually, there's all these emphasis to say, look, we need to increase production, we need to increase quality, so forth and so on, if we can just gather more information. And so for a lot of you that are on the operational side, there's this, I need more data to make better decisions and become more efficient, yet simultaneously, the gathering of that data exposes my systems to greater risk. How do we have to make that pay off for us in a positive manner? So there's two schools of thought at play. And this is something that I'm seeing change fairly significantly, primarily in the last 3 years. I'm actually seeing certain CIOs make the statement, I'm actually going to make a reduction in my defensive investments, and I'm going to make an increase in my resilience investments. So in a sense, maybe fewer firewalls, and I'm going to be really focused on backup and recovery, or I'll make other types of investment trade-offs there. We don't necessarily think that has to be a trade-off per se. Resilience is something that absolutely needs to be there, and we'll talk a little bit about those aspects here. But for this perspective, everything that we observe, and they didn't mention specifically on Palo Alto, so we've got a lot of observers out there, things still come from the outside world into the business side of the network, and then from the business side of the network, making their way down into the operational space. Now, some of the examples given here, specifically on the PETYA, not PETYA perspective, not initially a purposeful target. The operational side was not a purposeful target per se. It was simply, as the reference was, collateral damage. There was a very large number, I shouldn't say large number, there was a decent number of lawsuits that took place between insurance companies and manufacturers, specifically Mondelez and then Pfizer as well, where allegedly that little clause as in wartime acts of war do not apply to what's happening here. And the argument was that because the PETYA, not PETYA incident originated from an act between the Russian army against Ukraine, and it happened to spill over, therefore the insurance companies weren't planning to pay out when these spillover effects impacted both Mondelez and Pfizer. So understanding the cause and effect and the rationale behind it can be very important in these cases. But the point was, it was absolutely something that started in the IT finance department and then just made its way down to the OT space. Another important point on the Colonial Pipeline, and this is something I'm going to mention again later on, understanding how things happened is going to be very important because there is the reasonable probability that when people misunderstand, they will prescribe certain actions which are not necessarily appropriate. And the Colonial Pipeline, to me, is the absolute, like, a number one argument about that. As you may or may not know, it was basically an impact on a billing system, okay? Because it was a pipeline, because it made a lot of news, the TSA was asked to come in and intervene. This was not a space that the TSA was particularly well versed in. And there was a whole lot of appropriate defense statements made for that impact on the billing system, but unfortunately they were applied en masse to the entire pipeline, where it was not appropriate. So again, understanding the cause and effect is going to be very important, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. Fortunately, I do want to say the TSA eventually got things right, but again, that misunderstanding can cause problems and misappropriation of both resources as well as changes in processes in an inappropriate fashion. Okay, cyber resilience, there is a definition. So I don't have to come up here and create my own and then defend it, but basically NIST, who by the way is not a regulatory agency. This is something that comes up all the time. Well, I'm applying, we're complying with NIST regulations. No, NIST does not build regulations. They basically create either best or better practices that other entities will pick up and then reference within the regulations. So they're basically saying, looking at systems that use or enabled by cyber resources. Okay, reasonably vague. But I want to spend a moment to talk a little bit about this resource question and scope. For some of you, and possibly many of you, the success of your operational environment is going to be dependent on networked cyber resources, if you will, that are outside your direct control. Why is that relevant? Now, I'm not going to say the coward's way out, but let's say the somewhat lazy way out is sit there and say, I'm not responsible for it, therefore, I should assume there's nothing I can do about it. Okay. Prior to the Colonial Pipeline, 2018, again, I'm in Texas, this is why I happen to have some pretty good insight on this. There were 4 pipelines that shut down. Does anybody happen to remember that? Raise his arm to see if anyone raises his hand. Nope. Okay. 4 pipelines were shut down in almost a very similar way. But what happened was that between, if you're not all that familiar with the whole petrochemical space, you've got a source, referenced generally as upstream, by which you're getting natural gas, crude oil, whatever the case may be. That needs to go to somewhere where someone's going to process it, and from the process it gets distributed out to whomever. In some cases, like natural gas, you don't have to do a lot of processing necessarily. So you're going to purchase materials from the source, you're going to move them to someone who will consume them. That's sort of the simplest of things. There is a buying transaction at the front end, and there's a selling transaction at the back end, and there may be some intermediary processing storage transactions in between. Okay, setting that up easily enough. You probably didn't know we're going to talk about accounting here, did you? Anyway, the means of establishing the price of the buy and the price of the sell is very important to your accounting and finance department. That's done through EDI, electronic data interchange. All of these pipelines used a common vendor for that electronic data interchange who outsourced the actual cloud-based processing of that. That third-party cloud-based processor got popped. That EDI failed to operate. The pipelines wouldn't push the natural gas. Clearly not under your specific control, and certainly not under the control of the pipelines themselves, but at the same time, gas isn't being delivered. Similar type of scenario. So the point on this is that when we're talking about systems that are going to be enabled or necessary, if you're doing any tabletop desk exercises to determine what your exposure is to different environments, then in turn, this is something that you need to take account for. All right, great, Robert, those are cool words. What do we do about it? Your role in that may be limited to writing certain requirements, and those requirements come to what I believe is one of the most powerful entities for any company such as yourselves to defend yourselves, and that's called your acquisitions group. When you write an RFP or an RFI, or if you are evaluating a contract that someone's going to supply services to you, get those requirements put in there. Particularly at the RFI and RFP, because those are legal documents. Do you or do you not do this? Will you comply with these certain things? There's a lot of power to that. But consider what that wide range is and see what it is that you can do to introduce those at as early a stage as possible. All right. Whoops, I went too far. Okay. I like this slide, don't like this slide. What I like about it is that it shows this convergence that's taking place over time. Of course, there's no data behind it, which means I usually don't like graphs without data, but there we have it. This is conceptual. So the basic idea here is that we've got, at some point in time, and in some cases still, highly siloed operations activity. We've got highly siloed IT class activity. Most things are somewhat in that converged state already. If you are using Rockwell products or Siemens products or Delta V from Emerson or whatever the case might be, you've got all those elements which are of course unique to the operation local in that cell or machine, which is going to operate in those control loops, et cetera, but then there's going to be a whole set of Windows, and I'm going to really emphasize and double down on this, Windows applications. FactoryTalk is a .NET application with ASP interfaces running on Windows platforms using Microsoft SQL Server. It's about as pure and homogeneous a single vendor environment as you can basically imagine. WinCC from Siemens, that win is not a random syllable, okay? That wasn't like it just sounded cool, like, oh, we're going to win. No, these are Germans, they don't use it anyway. So Windows, 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 all right? So the point is that you've got a converged technology stack already. You might not have a converged management group to deal with that environment, but you will have that as it is. And it's really, really convenient for malevolent actors who wish to make money off of harming your environment that all that stuff is built on Windows. Because you don't have to, as an attacker, have to go off and relearn a whole bunch of very specific stuff on how do I deal with this particular PLC or actuator or whatever the case may be. as long as I know how to get Windows malware, and yes, they know how to do that, there's lots of it, as long as I can get it there, it will work. That's very helpful for them. It scales very, very nicely. There are instances, again, as John and Ryan were discussing, that there is some OT unique elements to malware out there. They're very dangerous, but at the same time, use of that usually does not scale particularly well. Okay. Ideally, we become more converged. The rationale here, and Dale Peterson, whom I hope some of you follow or at least attend his event down in Miami, has made this statement numerous times. Who are the people that are best positioned to defend industrial environments and industrial systems? And his answer has always been, who wants to do that? Okay, which is very helpful. Motivation is a good thing. My wife got the chemical engineering degree. I was the IT person. A little bit of conflict when Dad met me, but we got along okay. But she did not have anything in her curriculum that involved actually computing in general. My niece recently graduated with a mechanical engineering degree. She's now working for, I probably shouldn't say who she's working for now, but she just started a job. There was absolutely nothing in her curriculum that involved networking or compute in any form or fashion. It was just implied that you had to do it, but there was nothing formal about it, and certainly nothing to do with security. Safety, yes. And by the way, I apologize. We did not do a safety message at the beginning of the show, did we? No? Okay. All right, here's my safety message for you. If Kirk Cousins is in the game, don't bet on the game, either for or against. You never know what you're going to get. Okay, so there's like no predictability. Congratulations to the Vikings for last night, but who was going to predict that? Okay, safety message off. So convergence, I think, is inevitable. It's already happening. I mean, the good news is a lot of it is already there. The question is, are the investments made in securing that increasingly IT-based technology platform in place? And I went the wrong direction. My apologies. Okay, change management. A little bit for a specific piece. We're using the McKinsey 7.5 framework. Actually, it's not the model, it's a framework. This is more like MBA-ish types of things, but it's good to understand, and apologies for the formatting there. Basically, this is at kind of the top of the organization. There is some hard structures in place in which we've got a specific strategy at play. The structure that's generally in place is what's in place, and then the systems that utilize that structure to meet the strategy, those things are normally there. The softer items down below, shared values, skills, staff, and style, those, well, the fact that they're referred to as soft, in some ways are the harder things to change. I mean, as mentioned, I mean, you've heard it over and over again, the IT group and the OT group, they don't get along, don't have the shared values, they definitely got some very different styles and so forth. As mentioned, again, my wife's the chemical engineer, me the IT guy, Dad's approval, reasonably so. We got along okay. And we got 3 kids, so production was all right. And we'll figure out how quality is over time. But at the same time, some of these shared values and attitudes are things that you definitely have to adapt to. So, because I'm sort of old school security, it's people, it's process, and then it's technology in that order. Despite the fact I work for a technology company, it's still the right order. It's the people first, then let's get the process, and then we'll figure out what the right technology is that we need to apply. So, people. There's a lot of inertia to keep things the same. This is in no way unique to the operational IT divide. It exists everywhere. It happened to be a bit more pervasive in some of the other environments. Different goals and priorities at play, right? Quantities, quality, that's what the manufacturing folks are worried about from a business perspective. And of course, what's always forgotten is safety is job one. And then, of course, on the IT side, the safety element is like, what, am I going to get a paper cut? Or, I'm going to hurt myself lifting up this 3U device or something along those lines. Awareness of each other, always a pretty good challenge. Org structure, roles, and responsibilities. This one can be pretty darn interesting. If you're working for a large entity, particularly if it's a multinational, or if you're doing acquisitions and mergers and such, there is a lot of potential differences in who's doing what. Okay, so again, in some of these plants that we worked with, all the IT was done by a local person at that local environment. Okay, now, if we're talking about Midland, Texas, basically there's not a whole lot of options there, per se. Now, increasingly there has been, but in some of these environments, San Angelo or whatever it might be, you're not necessarily getting someone with a great deal of depth and experience. Hopefully you are, but not always the case. So it could be that all the IT type of activity, the networking and so forth, for the most part, is actually outsourced to some small local entity. Or it could be that the plant itself has got its own IT staff reporting to the plant manager, or everything is centralized, or it's centralized to the point that it actually touches the factory. And then we've got things like, well, in South America we do it this way, in North America we do it that way, and so forth. So there can be an incredible melange there, and that creates some significant challenges. Oh, I can't afford to backhaul everything from Brazil all the way back to the headquarters in the US, but in the US that we do. So what that means is that how we treat things from a security perspective and risk perspective in North America is very different from how we might do it in South America. So a lot of challenges there. And then you've got regulatory deltas between what's going on in the EU versus South America, and we potentially might slack a little bit in one place versus another. Risk tolerance and risk expectations. IT folks, of course, hey, we're Palo Alto, we're a security company, so we're all very much focused on, as a company, primarily on threats. In other words, if there is a malevolent actor who's intended to cause harm to us, therefore that's what we're really going to put a lot of focus on. On the other hand, I'm the OT person within Palo Alto. My perspective is, I'll say this, try to say this gently. In some ways, I don't care what the likely cause is that's going to cause harm. Whatever it is, from my perspective, is something that we need to address. All right, so what do I mean by that? Bad guys trying to do bad things, check, yes, understand, got that. Good people making mistakes, that's something rather different. And where I place my controls and the nature of those controls is going to be different versus my external actor who's going to try to cause some harm. A fairly old, misbehaving piece of equipment that suddenly starts spewing packets all over the place is equally problematic, but it's treated very differently than, again, that malevolent actor, sandworm, or whoever it may be, that might be causing to cause harm specifically to your environment. So, external bad actors, internal eager beavers trying to optimize a system they don't understand, bad piece of equipment which starts spewing ARPs all over the place. All of them can cause harm to the system. From my perspective, these are the range of risks that, oh, and by the way, I forgot to mention the dependency on the EDI folks. That's probably the IT side. So there's different perceptions of what represents risk. Now, I'm a numbers person. The most likely cause of an outage is probably going to be oops. Okay? After oops, then you might traverse, well, maybe it's going to be bad equipment. I'm going to bet on the bad equipment piece. And then thirdly, the thing that makes the news headline, of course, is going to be your bad actors Why? Because you have to report that in the SEC if you happen to be a public company. Okay. Now, the unfortunate side of that, and we'll get to this a little bit later when we talk about orgs, is your board members and your C whatever O people tend to focus on what's in the news, which is going to be your malware malevolent actor side. And the example I always like to give people when we talk about, say people talk about the Ukraine, right? As these gentlemen were talking about, by the way, I shouldn't say the Ukraine. Is the news-making things, but certain news-making things seem to attract interest from folks. So the Ukraine power grid hack, exciting, sexy stuff, and by the way, it was a really cool group of tradecraft. Credit to the attackers for that. Got a lot of attention. Who remembers Chernobyl? All right, 20,000 years. You don't go into that building. On the other hand, 6 hours outage, that got a lot of, that's probably more in people's heads than anything else. The Oldsmar thing, to me, is the wonderful example. Years and years of article, talking about how this attacker went in, potentially tried to poison something, and then very quietly, a few months back, oh, by the way, that was just someone making a mistake. There was no attack. Right? So think about it. What was the ratio of headlines and stories and news about an attacker went into Oldsmar and tried to poison lots of people versus how much news was there like, nope, that didn't happen? It's very unfortunate. But it drives a lot of behaviors, both inside your own organization as well as, again, as we discussed with the colonial aspect in regulatory environments. Okay. Shared values and strategy, I'm just going to power through this. It's the same type of thing, but the style and structure. But as I mentioned before, at this organizational level, it's good to make execs aware, but it's really important that you get it right and that you get what you report to them is accurate and precise, and what you suggest is prescriptively going to address the real problem. Because I guarantee you, what your board is going to be seeing is malware attack, malware attack, malware attack. Now, from a numbers perspective, from an external malevolent risk perspective, that's correct. On the other hand, I'll repeat it again, whatever it is that's likely to cause an outage is what it is that we concern ourselves with, and the number one cause is going to be external people making mistakes. But we have to address all of them. It's not like, oh, we're going to do this or that. We have to be able to do all of these things. Okay. Obviously, there's all these discussions about how do we get IT and OT to work together. There's just no two ways to get around it. You've got to work directly with them. You have to go physically present. You have to see the plant environment itself. You have to understand it. Again, my friend Dell, who made these things, he suggested barbecue. I'm from Texas. Honestly, I probably should not go to North Carolina or South Carolina and Georgia and discuss barbecue because it's not going to make things better. I've been, in the past it was like donuts. Again, in Texas, it's going to be tacos and kolaches. Anybody know what a kolache is? Excellent. Is that because you guys are from Texas? Excellent. Okay, very good. Yeah, I was worried I was going to say kolache and people were going to go, what? Okay, good. Yeah, so it's tacos, not burritos, and it's kolaches versus donuts. And again, we'll leave barbecue to another point in time. Okay, let's talk a little bit about process. Again, people, now we're at the process. I'll just go ahead and jump right into this. Unapologetically, NIST, CSF, cybersecurity framework, and zero trust architecture. If you're having a knee-jerk response to my mention of zero trust, give me a moment. We'll get back to why it's going to be defensible on that. But the point is, there is a process. And the good news on this, by the way, is that if there's anything that helps to bridge some of these discussions, If I say, oh, we're going to go to a process, and that process is actually codified as opposed to coming out my whatever portion of my body type of thing, it always helps. Yes, here's a process. Yes, smart guys other than me established it. Here's the way that we go about it. And then you take that. So I find that's very helpful. And we'll talk a little bit about zero trust. I'm going to plow through this a little bit. So there's a number of references here. There's that definition of zero trust, which is, by the way, has been around like a long time. I will acknowledge when I first got involved in the operational security space, this was 2012, I was working with a company called World Tech, and we brought together a set of rules to help protect stuff. There was all this emphasis on DPI. DPI, what? DPI, yeah, deep packet inspection. Okay, that's cool. Since I've been doing security a long time, I didn't even think to give it a name, but okay, yes, of course you're doing deep packet inspection. Zero trust actually came from a set of practices that actually came to the fore in the literature at the same time that DPI was coming online. So I don't think I mentioned, prior to coming here at Palo Alto, I was responsible for a tool called Snort. Anybody familiar with Snort? Yep. Ooh, I got a hoop. All right. So yeah, I was product manager for Snort for about 4 years over at Cisco. Literally at the same time that zero trust concepts were actually coming online in the literature. So this is new, but not really new. The fact that it's being applied from NIST and TSA to OT is somewhat new, and let me acknowledge, somewhat controversial. So where? All right, we really need to blow this up significantly. You remember the discussion about WinCC and Factory Talk and Ovation? Everything is a bunch of Windows boxes. That is a great spot for zero trust to work. Right? Anybody who's dealing with a workstation or connecting to Asset Center or whatever element that you're dealing with there, again, that technology stack is great for a zero trust application security. Anywhere near to a control loop is not. So at level 3, my claim is you've got an infrastructure that is zero trust ready. Down below that, don't take it there. Don't even try to go in that direction there. Because this is the case where the security is potentially a risk to your resiliency. Okay, so I'll just repeat that. The misapplication of certain security practices can themselves be a risk. In the concept of zero trust, it is probably your best bet to be able to stop a ransomware campaign. Farther down below, it's itself potentially a risk and just inherently non-viable for what's actually happening in your factory today. And sadly enough, you're probably not even going to be able to buy the equipment that would fully support those concepts for a few years. Consider the following. ODVA, anybody familiar with ODVA? Who's ODVA? No? Okay, ODVA is the standards body responsible for SIP EIP, the primary protocol that's going to be used by Rockwell and others. The concept of authentication and authorization for that kit became part of the standard in 2018, not that long ago. To do authentication and authorization for a lot of the Rockwell environments now involves a separate piece of hardware that you put above the cell of the machine as your authentication boundary. In other words, it's a hardware overlay just to do authentication. And if you can't do authentication, you can't do zero trust. There is a journey at play here. You need to be able to understand the surface, the attack surface. Okay, fine. As I mentioned before, understanding the full scope of what's necessary for your process to work is very important. Even if you can't yourself control it, you should at least have a knowledge of where your exposure is and where it's at. Look at who's talking to what. This is just classic visibility. But extend that beyond just your factory boundary. look outside. I've got MES over here. Oh, we've got digital twins over there. Oh, I've got a gateway in which I'm receiving natural gas from a pipeline or something. We have to do exchange on information there. Consider those types of things. Understand where you can apply zero trust and where you cannot do it. Create policy, and of course, as always, apply, monitor, and maintain. That's a pretty standard process. So from a technology perspective, this slide I like a lot, but it takes a little bit of explanation, particularly applicable in the oil and gas space. I have worked with numerous petrochemical entities where the discussion often comes to, well, where are we going to apply these investments to? And the question sort of comes down to, how much longer are we going to maintain that lease? How much longer do we plan to keep that pipeline? How much longer are we planning to keep these particular rigs online or whatever the case may be? And as I mentioned before, my father-in-law, again, ran and built chemical plants for Goodyear, and I think there's only 4 of them left, and they've sold them off. So there's significantly more transience at play there. I mean, normally if I look at an operation, an OT environment, it's fairly static, but at the same time, maybe I'm selling these assets, offshoring things. Oh, nope, it's coming back. Now we're nearshoring. It means it's in Mexico. Nope, we're fully onshoring it. Yes, it's building new chip plants out in Arizona and such. But there's a lot more dynamism in this. Here's this asset / factory, and we're going to keep it and not. So things can get fairly complicated. And then there's going to be this question of, well, the IT group sort of knows how to do that play well enough, but what's that state on the OT side? Yes, we just bought a factory that's ready-made to go. It's over in Malaysia, but they're using a whole set of automation vendors and equipment that we're not familiar with. So is that a challenge? Is that not a challenge? Tough to say. Either way, complexity is a significant challenge, more so on the IT side because the nature of things, there's a lot more IT vendors than there are OT vendors out there. And there's consolidation, which is taking place. In fact, just outside those doors, there's a company which will cease to exist as a standalone entity in a few months. That news was just recently made there, which makes things, again, a little more complex. If you can establish a common platform, you reduce the costs, right? A little bit self-serving because we are a major security platform vendor, of course, but at the same time, the economics don't lie. We're not the only people who come up with this. How many different firewalls am I going to be dealing with? From the resiliency perspective, having 2 can make sense, as in like I cover in front. Some people buy into that story, not some others. If you've got 3 or 4, it becomes more problematic because you have to, maintain those skill sets and you have to be able to manage them accordingly. So that can create a significant problem out there. Plenty of ROI stuff. Obviously, this is our own document there, so you're going to take that with a grain of salt. I fully expect that. I understand it. But we're not going to be the only vendor out there who's getting these same things. And by the way, as a vendor person, we end up talking to folks like yourselves that'll say, hey, here's how I want to buy these things from you and so forth, and I want to consolidate. So the point is, we get told X number of times we need to consolidate because it's going to save headcount, it's going to save complexity. Please help us justify that, and this is where we end up with these kinds of documents. Again, this is just more examples of how we need to consolidate things, but just to kind of close out, really emphasize working with the IT and OT people. Yes, there's conflict. Yes, there's different folks there. Yes, there are people who will bet on Kirk Cousin games. Just recognize, what it is that we have in common and then work to move forward. Moving forward must happen and it will happen. And with that, I want to thank you very much for your time, and I appreciate your attendance today. And I'll be out somewhere out there if you have any questions.